All right, now that you understand how the effect hook works, let's see how we can fetch data from the server. In this section, we're going to use a fake backend called JSON placeholder. You can find it at this address, jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. On this website, we have various endpoints for getting dummy data. For example, we can get a list of posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. If we click on the users, look, if we send a request to this address, we get a bunch of users where each user object has properties like ID, name, username, and so on. Now, to send a request to the server, we can use the fetch function that is implemented in all modern browsers. But a lot of people, including myself, prefer to use a library called Axios. So here in the terminal, let's install Axios version 1.3.4. Good. Now, here in the app component, we're going to fetch the list of users from JSON placeholder. So on the top, first we import Axios from Axios. Next, we use the state hook for declaring a state variable for storing our users. I'm going to initialize this to an empty array and call it users. Okay. Next, we need to use the effect hook. And this is where we're going to call the server. To do that, we're going to call axios.get. And here we pass the address or the URL of an endpoint. So back to JSON placeholder, we're going to grab this URL and paste it here in quotes. Okay. Now, because calling the server is not going to happen immediately, perhaps it's going to take half a second or longer, this method returns a promise. A promise is an object that holds the eventual result or failure of an asynchronous operation. Asynchronous is just a fancy term for an operation that might take a long time, okay? So this method returns a promise. Now, all promises have a method called then. So right after we can call then, or to make our code a little bit cleaner, we can put then on the new line. We call this method, and here we pass a callback function. That function will get executed when our promise is resolved and the result is ready. In this case, we need to pass a function that has a parameter called res or response, whatever you prefer. I'm going to go with res, that is shorter. Now in this function, let's just do a console.log and log the response on the console. So back to the browser, this is what we get. In this response object, we have properties like config, data. This is where we have our user objects. We also have headers, request, status that is set to 200, which means successful. We also have status text. So now if we log res.data, we should see our user objects. But there is a tiny problem here. What if you want to print the name of the first user? If we access the first element in this array and then try to access the name property, look, we don't have auto completion. This is where we can use TypeScript to add auto completion and type safety to our code, so we don't access invalid properties. So up here, we use an interface to define the shape of our user objects. Now, as you see, each user object has properties like ID, name, username, and so on. Let's say we're only interested in the first two properties. So here we say each user has an ID, that is a number, and a name, that is a string. We don't have to type out all those user properties here if you are not going to use them, okay? Now that we have this interface, when calling the get method, here in angle brackets, we specify the type of data we're going to fetch, that is user array. And with that, when we type a period here, we get auto completion. So we can print the name of the first user, okay? Now, instead of doing console.log, we're going to call setUsers and pass res.data. Now here we have a compilation error because we initialized the user's constant with an empty array, so the TypeScript compiler doesn't know the type of objects we're going to store here. Are we going to store numbers, strings, objects, or what? So once again, we need to type angle brackets and specify the type of this array, that is user array. Now the error goes away. Now, because we have set the state here, we have to add an empty array as the dependency to this effect. This is very important. Always remember to add this, because otherwise, as you saw earlier, you'll end up in an infinite loop and you will constantly hit the server sending hundreds or thousands of requests. Now the final step. Now that we have the users, let's render them here. So we're going to render a URL. Now here we're going to grab our users and map each user to a list item. Next, we set the key to user.id. Look, again, we have IntelliSense or auto-completion. This is very helpful. And for the text, we're going to render user.name. So here's the list of our users. Beautiful.